People like you should stay invisible." The words landed with the kind of practiced arrogance that only someone born into privilege could deliver without raising his voice. The executive boardroom fell into a silence so complete that even the quiet hum of the ceiling vents seemed suddenly louder. Naomi Brooks stood perfectly still beside the polished walnut conference table, one hand wrapped around the silver coffee tray she had carried through these doors hundreds of times before. A faint drop of dark roast coffee had escaped the rim of a porcelain cup, leaving a tiny stain no larger than a quarter near Richard Caldwell's leather portfolio. To Naomi, it looked insignificant. To Richard Caldwell, the billionaire CEO of Caldwell Technologies, it was apparently proof that someone like her didn't belong anywhere near people like him. Several executives lowered their eyes. Others exchanged uncomfortable glances, but said nothing. No one challenged the richest man in the room. Richard slowly wiped the small stain with a crisp, white linen napkin before looking directly at Naomi, as though she had personally insulted him. "Do your job," he said evenly. "Leave the thinking to people who actually built something." His voice never rose, yet every word carried the weight of public humiliation. Naomi quietly nodded. "Yes, sir." She neither defended herself nor apologized again. She simply reached for the damp cloth tucked into her apron pocket, carefully polished the spotless table until every trace of the coffee disappeared, and lifted the empty tray against her side. At 34 years old, Naomi had learned long ago that silence often protected dignity better than arguments ever could. She turned toward the doorway, her shoes making almost no sound across the marble floor. Behind her, the board meeting resumed as though she had already vanished. Charts appeared across massive screens. Lawyers shuffled thick contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Investors leaned forward with eager smiles. Naomi was supposed to disappear into the quiet hallways of the Caldwell estate, invisible once again. But as she gently closed the conference room door behind her, something unexpected caught her attention. Through the narrow opening before the latch clicked shut, she noticed a framed family photograph resting on a bookshelf inside Richard's private office across the hall. She had dusted that frame countless times during the past 2 years, yet today something felt different. The woman smiling beside a much younger Richard looked strangely familiar. Naomi slowed her steps without realizing it. The woman's warm eyes, silver necklace, and gentle smile awakened a memory she couldn't immediately place. Before she could think further, one of the assistants hurried past carrying another stack of legal folders. "Meeting's running ahead of schedule," he muttered without looking at her. Naomi quietly stepped aside, letting him pass. She continued down the long hallway lined with towering windows where the afternoon sunlight reflected across polished stone like liquid gold. Outside, expensive black SUVs waited beneath fluttering American flags while reporters gathered behind security barriers, unaware that inside the building one signature could reshape an entire industry before sunset. Naomi paused beside one of the windows for only a heartbeat, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. She adjusted the small silver cross around her neck, took a slow breath, and reminded herself that another room still needed cleaning. Yet deep inside, an uneasy feeling refused to disappear, as though the words she had just endured were only the beginning of something far more important. And somewhere within that building, hidden behind polished smiles and expensive suits, a truth was quietly waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Naomi Brooks had never imagined that her life would be measured by polished floors, folded towels, and quiet footsteps. But that was exactly where fate had carried her. Every weekday before sunrise, she left the modest brick duplex she rented on the east side of Charlotte, carrying the same insulated lunch bag her mother had stitched nearly 15 years earlier. The drive to the Caldwell estate took just over 30 minutes if traffic stayed light, giving her enough time to watch the city slowly wake beneath pale orange skies. Expensive high-rise buildings caught the first sunlight long before it reached the older neighborhoods where she lived, and every morning she noticed the difference without bitterness. Her grandmother had always told her that sunlight eventually reached every window, even if some had to wait a little longer. Naomi believed that. It was one of the reasons she smiled so easily, even on difficult days. Few people inside the mansion knew anything about her beyond the name embroidered on her Navy housekeeping uniform. They never knew she had once studied nonprofit administration at a respected state university before leaving school during her final year. They never learned that she had spent 6 years caring for her mother through a long illness, juggling part-time jobs until the hospital bills swallowed every savings account they had managed to build. By the time her mother quietly passed away, the degree was gone, the career was gone, and so were most of the opportunities people her age had already seized. What remained was resilience, faith, and the simple habit of treating every person with kindness regardless of how they treated her in return. Every room Naomi cleaned told a different story about the people who occupied it. Children's bedrooms still held stuffed animals that had not been touched in years. Guest suites smelled faintly of cedar and expensive cologne. The library carried the comforting scent of worn leather bindings and old paper, reminding her of afternoons spent studying before life unexpectedly changed direction. She noticed details because she cared, not because anyone asked her to. If a vase leaned slightly to one side, she straightened it. If a family photograph collected dust around its edges, she polished the frame until every smile inside it looked alive again. The staff appreciated her gentle spirit. The gardeners greeted her every morning. The security guards held doors open when her cart became too heavy. Even the estate chef quietly set aside fresh blueberry muffins whenever he knew she had skipped breakfast. Kindness traveled through service hallways more often than luxury ever did. Yet one room always felt different. Richard Caldwell's private office remained untouched except during carefully scheduled hours. Every object seemed arranged with mathematical precision. Awards covered one wall. Financial magazines displayed his face beside headlines celebrating another billion-dollar acquisition. Near the bookshelf rested the framed photograph Naomi had noticed earlier that afternoon. She had dusted it countless times over the past 2 years, but today the image refused to leave her thoughts. The elegant older woman standing beside a younger Richard smiled with unmistakable warmth, wearing a delicate silver necklace shaped like an oak leaf. Naomi suddenly stopped in the middle of wiping a crystal display cabinet as a forgotten memory surfaced with startling clarity. She had seen that necklace before, years ago, under completely different circumstances. The realization sent a quiet chill through her chest. She looked back toward the closed office door, her heartbeat slowing instead of racing. Somewhere inside her memory, a forgotten conversation had begun knocking softly, asking to be remembered before it was too late. Richard Caldwell believed success could be measured in stock prices, acquisition reports, and the silence that followed whenever he entered a room. At 55 years old, he had built Caldwell Technologies into one of the fastest-growing engineering firms in the country, appearing regularly on magazine covers beside headlines celebrating innovation, leadership, and relentless ambition. Financial news anchors praised his instincts. Investors admired his confidence. Young entrepreneurs quoted his speeches as if they were modern business scripture. To the outside world, Richard represented the American dream perfected through discipline and intelligence. Inside the walls of his own estate, however, another version of the man quietly existed. Every minute of his day was scheduled with military precision. Breakfast appeared exactly at 6:30. Meetings started exactly on time. Fresh flowers were replaced every Monday morning. Nothing was allowed to interrupt the order he had spent decades creating. Employees quickly learned that perfection earned silence, while even the smallest mistake invited disappointment. Richard rarely shouted. He did not need to. His calm voice carried enough authority to make experienced executives second-guess themselves. To him, every person occupied a place in an invisible hierarchy. Investors belonged at the top. Executives stood close behind. Assistants existed to anticipate needs before they were spoken aloud. Housekeepers cleaned what others built. Gardeners maintained what others owned. He never considered this cruelty. In his mind, it was simply how the world functioned. The value of a person was reflected by the chair they occupied. The larger the office, the greater the respect. It was a philosophy he had accepted so completely that he no longer questioned it. That afternoon, the boardroom buzzed with quiet anticipation as attorneys reviewed the final pages of a merger agreement expected to reshape the company for decades. Richard stood beside the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Charlotte skyline, hands folded behind his back, while sunlight reflected across the glass towers below. His chief financial officer explained projected earnings. Senior partners nodded approvingly. Every number pointed toward another historic victory. Yet Richard hardly listened. His confidence had already moved beyond the presentation. In his mind, the deal was finished before the ink ever touched the paper. Near the doorway, the assistant who had rushed past Naomi earlier organized another stack of confidential folders before approaching Richard. "Everything is ready, sir," he said quietly. Richard accepted the top document without looking at the young man. "It always is," he replied. Several board members smiled politely, accustomed to his unwavering certainty. Across the hall, Naomi carefully arranged fresh flowers in the reception area, unaware that fragments of the conversation drifted through the partially opened office door. A familiar company name reached her ears, followed by the mention of a family investment trust. Her hands paused over the crystal vase. Something inside her memory stirred again, stronger than before. Meanwhile, Richard reached toward the framed photograph resting beside his desk. For only a brief second, his expression softened as his fingers brushed away an invisible speck of dust from the smiling woman beside him. "Mother always believed people deserved second chances," he murmured almost to himself before setting the frame back exactly where it belonged. The warmth vanished from his face as quickly as it had appeared. He straightened his tailored jacket, closed the folder with quiet confidence, and walked back toward the conference room convinced that before the day ended, he would celebrate the greatest business triumph of his career, never realizing that the person he had dismissed only minutes earlier carried the one piece of forgotten truth capable of changing everything. Naomi remained standing beside the reception desk long after the assistant disappeared into the conference room. The polished crystal vase rested quietly beneath her fingertips, but her thoughts refused to settle. The woman in the photograph was no longer simply a familiar face. Her name had finally returned with unmistakable clarity. Eleanor Caldwell. 7 years earlier, Naomi had spent nearly 18 months volunteering every Saturday at a small nonprofit senior center on the outskirts of Charlotte while caring for her own mother. Eleanor had often arrived alone, always dressed elegantly despite her declining health, wearing the same delicate silver oak leaf necklace that sparkled softly whenever sunlight reached the dining room windows. Unlike many wealthy donors who visited only for publicity, Eleanor stayed for hours, talking with residents, folding blankets, reading books aloud, and insisting that every person deserved to be seen before they were judged. Naomi remembered one particular afternoon when Eleanor had quietly admitted that she worried about her son. "Richard has a brilliant mind," she had said with a gentle smile. "But success can become a wall if you let it convince you that people only matter when they are useful." At the time, Naomi had simply listened. She never imagined those words would return years later with such urgency. A sudden burst of applause echoed faintly through the hallway, pulling her back to the present. The attorneys were preparing the final signing. Naomi glanced toward the closed conference room doors, then back at the photograph inside Richard's office. Her heartbeat quickened. Earlier, she had overheard the name of the investment group leading the merger. Now another memory surfaced, one she had nearly forgotten. Eleanor had once spoken about an old business associate she deeply regretted trusting, a man she described as charming in public but dangerously patient in private. "If Richard ever works with him," Eleanor had whispered during that conversation years ago, "I hope someone stops him before it is too late." Naomi remembered asking for the man's name. Eleanor had answered without hesitation. It was the very same name she had heard only minutes earlier drifting from the boardroom. Her breath caught. She looked toward the hallway clock. There was still time. Without allowing herself another moment to hesitate, Naomi carefully placed the cleaning cloth onto her cart and walked toward the conference room. Every step across the marble floor seemed louder than the last. 2 assistants passed her without paying attention. A security guard nodded politely as she approached the double doors. She reached the entrance just as one of the attorneys prepared to close them before the signing. "Excuse me," Naomi said quietly but clearly. The attorney paused, surprised. "This meeting is private." Naomi swallowed carefully. "I understand, but I need to speak with Mr. Caldwell. It will only take a moment." Her calm voice carried into the room. Richard looked up from the contract, irritation immediately crossing his face. "What is it now?" he asked. Naomi met his eyes without raising her own voice. "Sir, I believe the company you are about to trust may be connected to someone your mother once warned you about." The room fell perfectly still. Several executives stared at her in disbelief. Richard slowly closed the folder in front of him, not because he believed her, but because he could not believe what he had just heard. Then a faint, humorless smile crossed his face. "You have crossed far beyond your responsibilities," he said coldly. "My mother has nothing to do with this meeting, and neither do you." Naomi remained composed. "Sir, I knew your mother years ago. She asked that if I ever recognized that name around you, I should make certain you looked twice before trusting it." Richard's expression hardened. "That will be enough. Leave this room immediately." Yet even as Naomi quietly turned toward the door, the uneasy silence she left behind lingered over the conference table like a question no one inside could quite bring themselves to ignore. The silence inside the conference room lasted only a moment before it dissolved into restrained smiles and uncertain glances. One executive lowered his eyes toward the contract while another quietly cleared his throat, pretending to review financial projections. Richard Caldwell remained standing at the head of the table, his expression calm but unmistakably cold. "This meeting is about facts," he said, his voice measured enough to quiet the room. "Not stories from someone who cleans the hallways." A few nervous chuckles followed, not because the remark was amusing, but because no one wanted to be the first to disagree with the man who controlled every career in that room. Naomi stood with both hands gently folded in front of her. She neither argued nor showed embarrassment. She simply looked at Richard with the same quiet composure she had carried throughout every difficult season of her life. "I understand why you do not believe me," she said softly. "I only wanted you to look one more time before you signed." Richard stepped closer, stopping several feet away. His expensive Italian shoes reflected against the polished marble floor, while Naomi's practical work shoes remained planted without hesitation. The difference between them extended far beyond clothing. It was wealth and struggle, influence and invisibility, authority and humility standing face to face beneath the same bright lights. "You presume far too much," Richard replied. "My mother met thousands of people. The fact that you crossed paths with her does not give you permission to interrupt a board meeting." Naomi nodded respectfully. "You are right, sir. It does not." But she remembered people in ways most of us never do. Richard's jaw tightened. Before he could answer, one of the senior attorneys quietly leaned toward him. "Perhaps we should continue with the signing. The investors are waiting." Richard never looked away from Naomi. "Security," he said calmly. The word echoed through the room more heavily than if he had shouted it. Within seconds, two members of the estate security staff appeared at the doorway. Both men recognized Naomi immediately. They had exchanged friendly greetings with her almost every morning for the past 2 years. One hesitated before speaking. "Miss Brooks?" he asked gently. Naomi offered them a small reassuring smile before either man felt forced to choose between kindness and duty. "It is all right," she said. "I can find my own way." Richard turned back toward the conference table as though the matter had already ended. "Please make certain she leaves the executive floor. Effective immediately, her services at this estate are no longer required." No one reacted aloud. Several executives lowered their eyes toward the documents in front of them. Even those who privately questioned the decision remained silent, unwilling to risk their own positions. Naomi accepted the words without protest. She slowly removed the identification badge clipped neatly to her uniform and placed it on the reception desk outside the conference room. Her fingers lingered on the plastic card for only a second before she stepped away. As she pushed her cleaning cart down the long hallway for what she believed would be the last time, familiar faces quietly watched from open office doors. The pastry chef looked stunned. One of the receptionists pressed her lips together, fighting the urge to say something. The head gardener removed his cap in silent respect as Naomi passed the tall windows overlooking the estate grounds. Warm afternoon sunlight still poured across the marble floors exactly as it had an hour earlier, but everything somehow felt different. Naomi paused beside the front entrance and glanced once toward the upper floor where the conference room overlooked the city skyline. She whispered almost to herself, "I hope I was wrong." Then she stepped outside into the gentle summer breeze, carrying nothing except her lunch bag, her worn sweater, and the quiet peace that comes from knowing she had spoken the truth even when no one wanted to hear it. Naomi walked slowly down the stone pathway that curved away from the Caldwell estate. the late afternoon sun stretching her shadow across the perfectly trimmed lawn until it disappeared beyond the wrought iron gates. For the first time in 2 years, she carried no cleaning supplies, no schedule, and no certainty about where she would work next week. The only sound around her was the gentle rustling of oak leaves swaying in the warm Carolina breeze and the distant chorus of birds settling into the branches above. She reached the small bus stop a quarter of a mile from the estate and quietly sat on the weathered wooden bench beneath a fading blue shelter. A city bus would not arrive for another 20 minutes. She welcomed the silence. It gave her room to breathe. She rested her lunch bag beside her feet and folded her hands together, watching sunlight shimmer across the nearby pond where tiny ripples spread each time a fish broke the surface. The world looked almost impossibly peaceful, completely unaware that a single decision inside a nearby boardroom might change countless lives before sunset. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, remembering Eleanor Caldwell's gentle smile from years ago. She could still hear the older woman's calm voice saying that truth sometimes arrived quietly because it trusted people to recognize it without shouting. Naomi wondered whether she had failed that trust. Perhaps she had remembered the conversation incorrectly. Perhaps Richard had been right to dismiss her. Yet deep inside, the uneasy feeling refused to fade. She reached into her lunch bag and carefully removed the small Bible her mother had given her before passing away. Its leather cover had softened with age, and several pages were marked by handwritten notes tucked neatly into the margins. Naomi did not open it immediately. She simply held it against her lap, letting familiar memories settle her anxious thoughts. Across town, inside the conference room overlooking the Charlotte skyline, crystal glasses reflected the golden light pouring through the windows as attorneys prepared the final signature pages. Expensive fountain pens rested beside thick stacks of contracts. Investors exchanged confident smiles. Richard Caldwell straightened his jacket and reached for the polished black pen placed directly before him. The room felt lighter now that the interruption had ended. At least that was what everyone wanted to believe. Just as Richard uncapped the pen, the sharp vibration of a cell phone broke the silence. Every head turned toward the sound. Richard glanced down at the screen. The caller identification displayed only 3 words: St. Augustine Care Center. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. That number had not appeared in nearly 5 years, not since the weeks following his mother's funeral. Several executives waited politely while Richard hesitated. He almost declined the call. Instead, something he could not explain made him answer. Richard Caldwell speaking. The room remained perfectly still. No one spoke. No papers moved. A calm, elderly woman's voice answered from the other end of the line. Mr. Caldwell, I sincerely apologize for contacting you without notice, but while preparing to renovate one of our storage rooms this morning, we discovered a sealed box that belonged to your mother. Inside was a journal addressed specifically to you, along with written instructions that it should only be delivered if someone named Naomi Brooks ever attempted to warn you about a man she believed you should never trust. Richard's fingers slowly tightened around the phone. Every ounce of color drained from his face. Across the city, Naomi looked toward the glowing evening sky as a gentle breeze lifted a few loose strands of her hair. She had no idea that at that exact moment, the truth she had carried with quiet courage was finally beginning to find its voice. Richard Caldwell did not realize he had stopped breathing until the voice on the telephone gently asked whether he was still there. Every person around the conference table watched him in complete silence as the confidence that had defined him only moments earlier slowly disappeared from his face. He swallowed carefully before answering. You said? Naomi Brooks. The woman from St. Augustine Care Center responded with quiet certainty. Yes, sir. Your mother wrote her name several times throughout the journal. She explained that Miss Brooks volunteered here for more than a year while caring for her own mother. They became close friends. Your mother believed Miss Brooks possessed something that could not be purchased or negotiated. She trusted her judgment. Richard lowered himself into his chair without realizing he had done so. His hand rested motionless on the unsigned contract while memories he had not visited in years began returning with uncomfortable clarity. He remembered his mother's repeated warnings that success should never replace discernment. He remembered dismissing those conversations as the sentimental concerns of someone who had never experienced modern corporate competition. Most painfully of all, he remembered the expression on Naomi's face only minutes earlier. She had not spoken with anger. She had not demanded recognition. She had simply asked him to look one more time before signing. The elderly woman continued. "There is something else, Mr. Caldwell. Your mother included copies of letters documenting why she ended every business relationship with Harold Whitmore. She believed he deliberately concealed financial liabilities from trusted partners and manipulated agreements through shell companies. She instructed us to deliver everything immediately if his name ever reappeared in your life." Richard slowly lifted his eyes toward the thick contract lying open before him. The room remained frozen. Several executives exchanged uneasy glances after noticing the sudden change in his expression. Richard quietly covered the phone for a moment before looking directly at his chief legal officer. "How thoroughly did we investigate Whitmore Capital's holding companies?" The attorney blinked in surprise. "We completed the standard review, but because the structure includes several private entities, some historical records were." He stopped speaking as Richard's stare sharpened. "Incomplete?" Richard asked. The attorney reluctantly nodded. A heavy silence settled across the room. Richard uncovered the phone again. "Please send everything immediately," he said. "I am leaving now." After ending the call, he remained seated for only a heartbeat before closing the contract with deliberate care. The sound echoed through the conference room far louder than anyone expected. "This signing is postponed," he announced. Confused voices immediately filled the room. Investors protested. Advisors tried to speak over one another. Richard raised a single hand, and the noise disappeared as quickly as it had begun. "No document will be signed until every claim my mother recorded has been verified." His chief financial officer hesitated. "Sir, delaying this merger could cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars." Richard looked toward the conference room doors where Naomi had stood only a short time before. For the first time that afternoon, he heard his own words repeating inside his mind. "People like you should stay invisible." The sentence no longer sounded powerful. It sounded painfully small. He reached into his jacket pocket, removed his cellular phone, and searched for the estate manager's number with hands that were no longer completely steady. "Find Naomi Brooks," he said the instant the call connected. "Check every security camera, every entrance, every road leaving the estate. If she boarded a bus, follow it. If she called a taxi, locate it. I do not care how long it takes. Before anything else happens today, I need to tell her that I should have listened when she was the only person in the room brave enough to tell me the truth." The city bus had just begun pulling away from the curb when a black sedan appeared in the side mirror and carefully eased alongside it without blocking traffic. Naomi looked up from the small Bible resting in her lap, surprised to see the familiar Caldwell estate driver step out the moment both vehicles reached the next red light. He approached the bus entrance, spoke quietly with the driver, and a few seconds later Naomi heard her name called with unexpected urgency. She gathered her lunch bag, thanked the driver, and stepped onto the sidewalk where the warm evening air carried the scent of freshly cut grass after a long summer day. The estate driver removed his cap respectfully. "Miss Brooks," he said, slightly out of breath, "Mr. Caldwell is asking if you would be willing to return. He said it is important, but only if you choose to come." Naomi searched the man's face for a long moment. She found no pressure there, only sincerity. After a quiet breath, she nodded once. "All right." During the drive back, neither of them spoke very much. The setting sun painted the Charlotte skyline with shades of gold and amber while long shadows stretched across the highways. Naomi watched neighborhoods pass outside the window, wondering what could possibly have changed in less than an hour. When the sedan entered the estate gates once again, she immediately noticed something different. The front entrance stood open. Several staff members were gathered quietly along the marble foyer, not out of curiosity, but with expressions that reflected genuine concern. As Naomi stepped inside, every conversation stopped. Richard Caldwell was already waiting near the grand staircase. Gone was the commanding posture that usually filled every room before he spoke. His jacket had been removed. His tie hung slightly loosened. In one hand, he held a worn leather journal whose edges had faded with time. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Richard slowly walked forward until only a few feet separated them. Then, in front of every executive who had witnessed her dismissal and every employee who had watched her leave, He spoke words no one inside the estate had ever expected to hear. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "I was wrong." The silence that followed seemed to settle over every polished surface in the foyer. Richard lowered his eyes for a brief moment before continuing. "My mother trusted you because she recognized something I failed to see. She wrote about your kindness, your honesty, and your courage. She also warned me that one day I might become so confident in my own judgment that I would stop recognizing truth when it arrived from someone without power." He carefully opened the journal to a page marked by a faded ribbon. She wrote, "If Naomi Brooks ever tells you to stop and listen, do not measure her words by her position. Measure them by her character." Richard closed the journal gently. His voice grew softer. "Today I measured you by your uniform instead of your integrity. I judged your worth before I ever listened to your heart. I humiliated someone who was trying to protect me. I cannot undo that." Naomi looked at him with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the day. There was sadness in her eyes, but no bitterness. Richard drew a slow breath. "I am asking for your forgiveness, not because I deserve it, but because my mother spent her life teaching me the lesson that you lived without ever speaking it. You showed me more grace after being dismissed than I showed you while holding all the authority." Naomi smiled gently, the kind of smile that carried no triumph. "Your mother believed people could change," she answered. "If I truly respected her, then I have to believe that too." Richard felt the weight in his chest begin to lift for the first time that day. Around them, several employees quietly wiped away tears, not because a billionaire had apologized, but because they had just witnessed something far rarer than success. They had watched pride give way to humility, and dignity answer prejudice with compassion instead of resentment. The following Monday morning, the sun rose slowly over Charlotte, casting long ribbons of golden light across the glass walls of Caldwell Technologies. Employees arriving for work noticed something unusual before they even reached the front entrance. The marble nameplate that had always listed only executives had quietly gained one additional inscription beneath the company's community initiatives. It read, "The Eleanor Caldwell Foundation for Service and Integrity." There were no flashing cameras. No reporters crowded outside the building. No grand ceremony had been announced. The change seemed almost invisible, fitting for the lesson that had inspired it. Inside the lobby, Richard Caldwell stood near the entrance greeting employees one by one instead of waiting in the executive elevator as he had done for years. He shook hands with maintenance workers, receptionists, security officers, and interns with the same attention he once reserved only for investors and board members. Some looked surprised. Others smiled cautiously, wondering whether the change would last. Richard understood their uncertainty. Trust was never restored through speeches. It was rebuilt through consistent actions repeated every day. A few minutes later, the front doors opened once again. Naomi Brooks stepped inside, wearing a simple navy business suit instead of her housekeeping uniform. She had accepted Richard's invitation, not to return as a housekeeper, but to become the founding director of the Eleanor Caldwell Foundation, a program dedicated to supporting family caregivers, senior centers, and educational scholarships for people whose lives had been interrupted by hardship just as hers once had been. She paused briefly beneath the morning sunlight pouring through the tall windows before walking forward with the same quiet confidence she had carried long before anyone recognized her worth. Richard approached her with a warm smile and, without hesitation, opened the conference room door that had been closed to her only days earlier. This time there was no hesitation inside the room. Every executive rose to their feet, not because protocol demanded it, but because respect had finally caught up with truth. Richard waited until Naomi entered first before taking his own seat. The contract with Whitmore Capital had never been signed. Independent investigators later confirmed hidden liabilities spread across several undisclosed entities, saving the company from losses that would have echoed for years. Yet Richard rarely spoke about the financial victory. Whenever anyone asked what had truly changed his leadership, he simply pointed toward the framed photograph resting beside his desk. Eleanor Caldwell's gentle smile remained exactly where it had always been, but now another photograph stood beside it. It showed volunteers serving meals together at St. Augustine Care Center. Naomi stood near the center of the picture, smiling beside Eleanor years before either of them knew how important that friendship would become. Every afternoon, sunlight reached both photographs at nearly the same hour, covering the frames with the same warm glow before slowly fading into evening. Richard often paused during those quiet moments, remembering that success had once taught him how to build a company, but humility had finally taught him how to build character. As employees gradually left the office that evening, the hallways grew peaceful once more. The sound of hurried meetings gave way to soft footsteps, distant laughter, and the gentle closing of doors. Naomi was the last to leave the foundation office. She switched off the lights, stepped into the hallway, and looked through the tall windows where the fading sky reflected shades of amber and deep blue across the city. Richard stood several yards away holding the door open without saying a word. Naomi smiled, nodded gratefully, and walked into the cool evening air. The door closed quietly behind them, and for a long moment there was nothing left to hear except the breeze moving through the oak trees, carrying forward a truth that needed no applause because kindness had never been weakness. It had always been the strongest voice in the room.